Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Atlas Project. This is episode 20. We've actually made it 2/3 of the way through this book. We're finishing up part 2 tonight, discussing part 2, chapter 10, The Sign of the Dollar. I'm Ben Baer with the Ayn Rand Institute, and joining me soon will be Greg Salmieri in New York. I do want to start off tonight by making an announcement, the likes of which I've been making for the past few weeks, especially if you're just joining us for the first time, seeing this broadcast on Facebook for the first time. You should know that the Atlas Project is a weekly chapter-by-chapter reading group about Ayn Rand's magnum opus, Atlas Shrugged. And a big part of the reason that we planned and executed this project is because we wanted to be able to give readers a better understanding of the book, especially if they were thinking about participating in the essay contest about Atlas Shrugged, which the Institute also sponsors. The deadline for essay submissions for that contest is in May, which is about a month after we finish this project. And so if you're interested in winning up to $10,000 by writing an excellent essay, please consider participating in this project. And we're 2/3 of the way through the book right now, but you can still go back and watch all kinds of recordings of previous sessions. In the comments section for this video, I've left a few links. One is to the Facebook group that you can join to participate in the online discussions about the book in advance of the broadcast. Another is the Atlas Project on ARI Campus, where you can find links to all the recordings. And then, of course, there's a link to the essay contest itself with details about the questions that you can write about, the different kinds of prizes. There's not just national prizes, but regional prizes too, and special prizes for students who are below a certain age. So please consider that and think about the experience you can get by reflecting on, arguably one of history's greatest novels, and maybe even winning some money for it. That's all I've got tonight, so I'm going to turn things over in a second to Greg Salmieri in New York. I'll be joining Greg next week for the beginning of part 3, which will be fun. This will be the third trip to New York for that purpose, which will make things a lot easier technically. So, Greg?
Yeah, hi everyone. We're now, as Ben says, at the very end of part 2 of the novel. I meant to put the timeline up and the things down. So we're now at the very end of part 2 of the novel. So some of our questions for this week involve surveying the part as a whole, but we're in particular talking about this chapter 10 of part 2, the last chapter of the part. And let's start out by just recalling some of the key events of the chapter, and that'll give us an agenda. We'll, not strictly go through the chapter in order, but key to the main event. So the chapter is divided into 2 sequences, but it's pretty much a continuous flow of events following Dagny Taggart the whole way, right? It opens up with her in the train now bound to Utah and Colorado, that night's comet that at the end of the last chapter, she was about to get the comet, right? So it wakes up with her in the comet, some days into the trip, some ways west, and looking out the window as she's leaving the east and leaving the industrialized area of the country. And we get her reflections on this, her thoughts on it. We'll talk a bit about those thoughts. They give you a sense of her state of mind for the rest of the chapter. One of her thoughts is that she feels like there's nothing moving, there's something desolate, and like the earth is empty, and for that reason she decides to go to the dining car to take her dinner, rather than getting it delivered in her room. And on the way she encounters a conductor about to throw a tramp off the train, literally throw him off the train, throw him out the door of the train, and we'll talk about that. She intervenes and invites him to have dinner with her, and they have some interesting conversation during which it transpires that this tramp worked for the 20th Century Motor Company in Wisconsin, and he tells her the story of the 20th Century Motor Company, and that he and the other workers there may have been responsible for this catchphrase, "Who is John Galt?" because there was a John Galt at the 20th Century Motor Company, and we'll learn a bit about that. We then get a cut to Dagny having woken up out of a kind of fitful sleep. She'd been thinking about his story, drifting in and out of sleep, is very anxious, and we could see her anxiety. The train's still moving, at least it's still moving, even though we're on the bad set of track in the Kansas Western now. And but she's drifting in and out of sleep, having her thoughts, reflecting on what she can tell from the tramp story, and what she does and doesn't put together from the story, I think, is itself interesting, especially given that a lot of the readers draw inferences from the story that she hasn't. And then, at one point, she wakes up and the train is stopped. And she leaves her room looking to find out what's happening. It transpires. It's one of the frozen trains that we've heard about. And in trying to figure out what to do, looking around, surveying the train, she encounters Owen Kellogg, who we'll recall is the gentleman who she wanted to promote to head of a division in the first chapter and who quit, leaving her her first sense of helpless futility in which she, for the first time, had the "who is John Galt" question, or felt like the people feel when they say it. And she and Kellogg talk as they go to the nearest track phone to call a replacement crew, except that phone's broken and they go to the subsequent phone. And their conversation is interesting. We'll talk a bit about that. But while they're going to the track phone, she finds a nearby airfield, and she decides to take an airplane to Utah immediately so she can meet with Quentin Daniels, keep her appointment with him. And Kellogg agrees to take over the task of shepherding the train back to the nearest station where they can get a proper crew and so forth. And so that's what Dagny does. She flies to Utah. We have a really interesting description of her thoughts and her perspective on the flight, and there's some interesting metaphysics of that in a view of kind of her perspective on the world as she flies to Utah. She gets to Utah and asks to be taken to the Utah Institute of Technology, but she's immediately told why. There's no one there. Quentin Daniels just flew off, and we point to a plane that's flying away. Dagny immediately assumes what must be happening. It's the destroyer. She's somehow just beat her, and she flies off after him. And we get the flight narrated, her thoughts as she's flying narrated, and she loses the plane. It seems to have just disappeared in a rocky section of Colorado in the mountains where nobody could possibly land a plane. She circles looking for it, trying to find it, and as the chapter ends, she seems to be about to crash or in the process of crashing. Oh hell, who is John Galt, are her last words. And that's our sequence for the chapter. So our agenda just for tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about her reflections while she's alone, and the initial encounter between her and the tramp. I think we're going to spend a lot of time on the tramp's story, where we get more on 20th Century Motor Company, a little bit on Dagny's interactions with Owen Kellogg, with the other stranded passengers on the train, and on her kind of reflections on the world while she's flying. So, Ben, do you want to start us off with some reflections? I know we had some stuff in the comments, and you had some observations about about Dagny's thoughts as she's looking out the window at the beginning of the chapter.
Sure. Well, I thought I'd start by just sharing an observation that is not original to me. I got this originally from Harry Binswanger, who's an objectivist philosopher. And he pointed out that if you look at the beginning of chapter 10, she sat at the window of the train, her head thrown back, not moving, wishing she would never have to move again. If you look at that passage and then a few subsequent paragraphs, this is written almost exactly in parallel to the first time that we meet Dagny in the book, which is back in part 1, chapter 1, specifically page 12 of the standard edition. There's a lot of the exact same language. She's
also on a train that stops.
Also on a train that stops, that this time it's going in the opposite direction. And this time, instead of hearing a sunburst of sound, she's seeing a twilight draining the sky without the wound of a sunset. Whereas in the first, there's all kinds of emphasis on motion, dots of light slashing across the glass. Here, it seems like she's lost in a void. And she's hearing the same fourth knock of the train's wheels, whereas in the first chapter of the book, there's a stress on conscious purpose, and the whole scene is much more optimistic. Here, it's the purpose of an enemy moving inexorably, and whereas here she's thinking a lot about how she would never have to move again. She's used to having been the motive power of the train, but here she's wishing that it will go ahead moving without her. So the parallel in language is used generally to show how stark of a contrast there is between Dagny in this moment and Dagny at the beginning of the novel, and how much has happened to her because of the events of the novel. And she's apart from that, she's observing the countryside. She's observing the advance of nature where there used to be industry. She's looking at these two teenagers who are having a date, having an ice cream cone.
Just a thought I'd like to interject before we talk about the teenagers, because that's another interesting thing in the teenagers. Just about this parallelism of the passages, readers might want to keep that in mind when we get to the first chapter of Part 3, because there's also, if you reread that passage where we first meet Dagny in Part 1 and think about the ways in which there's parallelism to this passage in Chapter 10 when we see her on the train, you'll see other themes from that chapter are picked up on in a really interesting way in some of the descriptions early on in Chapter 1 of Part 3. So, and I think the parallelism in both cases is intentional, but also what bits of Chapter 1 are here in this description in Chapter 10 of Part 2, and which bits are there in the description in Chapter 1 of Part 3, itself reveals interesting things about her mood. So keep that in mind as you're reading Part 3 for people who are interested in these literary technique issues. But yeah, go on. Let's talk about the kids on a date.
Right. Well, so like I said, she's been traveling through the countryside. Everything's starting to look basically more like Starnesville, though there's, small towns here and there. And she notes these kids on a date who seem to be oblivious to sort of the encroaching wilderness. And she knows what it takes to be able to give them this date and this ice cream cone. And she screams to them, to whatever was human in any living being, don't let it go, don't let it go. And the issue of humanity versus inhumanity is a topic that's going to come up a lot in our discussion of this chapter. And I think that's there to sort of be the opening sounding of a note.
That's a good thought. I hadn't thought of that or noticed the whatever's human aspect of it. And that picks up on, as you'll say, we see a lot of people who don't seem to see each other as human or who do. So the thing that stood out to me about that, or just one thing to notice about that scene, particularly for people who've read others of Rand's work, is that phrase, don't let it go, is something she uses elsewhere. She has an article titled that. In fact, a lot of her later articles derive their titles from Atlas Shrugged in one way or another. But in her article use, it's she's talking about the American sense of life, as she calls it, what it is about America's spirit that's distinctive, and there's a worry about that going, and how to hold on to it and to save or preserve things that you think of as of value or that are values, to preserve your world. And that is, I think, what we see Dagny feeling now, right? She's fighting to save the last strip of her world. It's a sort of desperate battle, and she's seeing it go, and she's seeing these signs of it, like these kids who are having a nice evening. That's something that's not possible in Starnesville. It is possible in an industrial civilization, and she knows that. And she knows that that's slipping away. So I find that a really poignant scene. All right, so let's jump to well, it's not much of a jump. She she decides to go to the dining car. Part of her feeling is that this kind of loneliness and emptiness, and she wants to see ocean somewhere. And she encounters this scene of the tramp and the conductor, and I mean, what stands out about this scene? Yeah, Robert?
Well, the conductor is literally ready to kill him by throwing him off the train to a certain death, and he doesn't seem fazed by that. And the tramp is just about ready to accept that fate as well, but he does one or two things that Dagny notices, which shows her she shows her humanity to him, because he values these things, the whitened collar and the bundle.
Yeah, so let's start with this observation that the conductor's attitude, because he's about to throw or push this guy or demand that he leap to what would be certain death, and yet he doesn't. If he was angry at him, that would make sense and be, it would be easy to see that. But what's striking is that he doesn't seem to be angry to him. He doesn't seem to be angry. How did you put it, Robert? Impassive or indifferent?
Yeah, different.
Ben, I think we had some comments on this also on Facebook, right?
Well, we had asked a question about where in this chapter people either do or don't see each other as human beings, and this was the scene that most of the people cited as an example, both of the conductor who didn't and Dagny who did see him as one. Skylar, in particular, who just joined us, I noticed, noted the way he described it was Dagny responds to him as a living, breathing human being, while the conductor sees him as just another louse.
Yeah, so the conductor is seeing him not as a person anymore. And that's striking. It's not he's doing it out of rage, but the guy doesn't belong on the train, so he's going to kick him off the train, but it's sort of an indifference to whether he lives or dies. Now, Dagny sees him as a person, but Robert points out it's because of these little things, like his shirt collar starts, and he holds on to his little bundle of possessions as if the thing to worry about in the fall is whether he'll lose those possessions or not. I mean, you might think how wonderful Dagny, our heroine, sees this guy as a person, whereas the conductor, this character, doesn't regard him as a person. But we're given an explanation for why she views him as a person, right? As though that's some special act of magnanimity to be concerned when someone's about to jump to their death. So any thoughts on the significance of this? Because I don't think it's that here's Dagny who's lovely because she always views people as people, unlike this conductor.
I have a comment if nobody else does.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I just...
Goes with I think later on the tramp is talking to Dagny and he says, I thought it was kind of a sin to just sit there and wait and die, and he just kind of the type of person that takes care of these things. And it made me think of Henrietta Lacks. There was one, she's not a great person, but one of the things that somebody said about her was when she came into the doctor's office that she had cancer and she was dying, but she had painted her toenails, and that kind of struck the person as if even at this point she was taking care to do these little things. Mm-hmm. And that showed a little bit of the kind of person that she was, and I think that shows a little bit of the kind of person that this person is. He's trying to hold on to these little things. I think we're in the world where little things are all you have. Mm-hmm. So you have to hold on to them to show that to kind of hold on to normalcy or whatever you used to have before, I guess.
Yeah, so this is what it is, and this is why these gestures on the part of the tramp really stand out to Daphne. I think that's right. But why are we in a situation where she needs something to really stand out, not to be indifferent that somebody's about to jump to his death on pressure from somebody else? Because normally when you have a sympathetic character, you wouldn't need special reason to care about that. Ben, you were about to say something before when the
Yeah.
internet gods frowned upon you.
One of the online critics of this book that we've been referencing on occasion says about this scene, oh, so it's only because he's got a sense of property that Dagny cares, and if he didn't, she wouldn't have. And at first I thought, that's not really a fair interpretation of what's happening here. But then I thought, well, but, this guy is not the only guy that Dagny needs a special reason to feel this way toward. I mean, the whole chapter opens with her looking at her workers down on the track who have these wary, closed faces looking at her stonily. And it's because she remembers that she's accepted the role of being a slave and a slave driver of them. So something about her decision to come back to work here is making her view other people in this way. And they're viewing her this way.
That's what I see as a significant. They're in a position where they can't view each other as human beings. And we've already seen this when even the people she really cares, that are her friends, like Eddie, right? She looks at him with a kind of expression like, I'd feel compassion for you if we could still feel, but we don't feel. And this is a little bit later than now, but it's still in this chapter. Her voice is described as only having the metallic tinge of decision. Why a metallic? Like she's a business machine, which she was described as earlier. Always people said about Dagny that she's cut off from emotions, that she's just this kind of efficient business machine. That's what Jim would say. But I think we could see that it wasn't true of her early on in the novel, particularly if you think of that first scene with her, where she's enraptured hearing this symphony, right? But now she is functioning more, at least when she's in her work life, in this mechanical way, and she's distant from people and alienated from people. She doesn't have fellow feeling for them. So there's something that she's caught up in. And I think this also explains why the conductor is in this situation. Because this conductor is part of the crew of people, right, who snap and who then desert the train later this evening. And when they snap and desert the train, right, one of the things that strikes Dagny, now we're getting a little ahead of where we are in the chapter, but that's okay, is two things. When she looks at the roster and she sees that they've deserted, her first thought, which Kellogg kind of underscores for her, right, is they're still human and good for them. Which it doesn't seem like this conductor is still human in this moment when he's about to push this guy off to his death. And moreover, one of the things that strikes Dagny is that they put the lights out to guard the back of the train, as is customary. And she says they showed more regard for us than the country had shown for them, more seeing of us as humans. So that's another situation where there's who sees each other as human and who doesn't. So these people are caught up, it's like everybody on this train is caught up in this situation where it's difficult to see other people as human beings. And maybe that even comes to a head with this conductor incident, and he feels bad about it afterwards, and that's what leads to instigating the deserted train. We don't know, but we know that when they do desert the train, right, they leave the lights on behind it. And that Dagny, it's on this train, on this trip, that she's thinking about how the people looked at her like she wasn't a person. They don't have that recognition they normally have of her. So there's a syndrome affecting this whole group of people, and Dagny included. And it's these features of the bum that kind of snap her out of it in this moment, make her invite the bum in. And we can see there's a lot where you see a sense of the bum's humanity, and what it means to the bum to be a man, right, to be a human being, that he's going to not pounce on the food even though he's starving, that he's going to try to appreciate the kind of decorum of the rise above just kind of brute physical needs and such. Ben, is there anything else? I mean, and then we get a lot about the kind of situation that makes people not be able to view each other as human beings when we get to the bum's story about the 20th Century Motor Company. Ben, are there any points you think we should hit before we turn to that?
Just real quick, that there's the line that he gives when he's explaining, how he came to be a bum and how he got to be on this train. And he says, and she keeps asking, what are you running from the law? You don't want to be back east where the factories are. There aren't any factories back east. There's too much law. He just wants to keep moving, just to keep moving, you know. There's nothing to do in the East except sit under some hedge and wait to die. I don't think I'd mind it much now the dying. I know it would be a lot easier, only I think that it's a sin to sit down and let your life go without making a try for it. And she thinks of this as one of the most profoundly moral statements she's ever heard. The chapter opened with her talking about how she had always thought of herself as the motive power of the train. This echoes earlier chapters where she thought of herself as the motive power of her own happiness. And here we have the tramp also thinking about motion and the importance of motion. And up until now, there's been a strong connection between motion and motive power and motors and morality. And it really came to a head, if you remember, when Francisco was speaking to Reardon about how our moral code is our motive power. So this is in keeping with that line of development, and I think that it has a little bit more to go in this chapter. We'll see where it goes toward the end.
It's also significant that part of what Dagny notices is not just that it was one of the most moral statements she'd ever heard, but also that the tramp himself didn't know it, which suggests that people don't recognize what's best in them. And not only does it suggest that,
when
but
Francisco said that to him.
Yes, good. That's a good point. So it's already been a theme that people don't recognize what's best in them, right? And Reardon didn't when Francisco made that point to him, as you say. But also that Dagny is onto this fact that people don't always recognize the best in them, which I'm not sure if we had as much sign of before, although maybe we have. So that's exciting. Does anyone else have anything they want to comment on or raise or ask about, or any thoughts about the chapter up to this point, that is prior to the bomb starting to tell his story? Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking, you keep saying, using the thing of human being or not human being, and I see the distinction being what kind of human being, i.e. the bum has two qualities that Dagny appreciates, which is a kind of dignity, and more than that, a kind of effort. And what Dagny despises are, because they're all human beings, the conductor is a human being, but what kind of a human being is he? At this point, he's decided to simply be a functionary and follow the recipe as he reads it, and not consider or think or make, and here's the word that I would use, effort. And Dagny has always made an effort. She, did the roof, she lit the head, she did all of that kind of thing, whereas the woman in town made no effort of any sort of anything. She just accepted it. And I find the white collar an effort at dignity and his moving an effort toward something. So I think that's the moral compass that she's using. Yeah.
Will?
And that brings up something I was reminded of when thinking about this, what kind of moral standard is represented here, where someone talks about effort. And that is where, when Reardon is asked what he actually wanted, in that time he did not say to make a big profit on my products, but where he says to exchange my best effort for the best efforts of others.
There you go.
Mm-hmm. So my thought on this is, so this language of who sees each other as human and who doesn't, and are you a human or not, is not language we're putting onto it. It's language we're finding in the novel. And so that's why I'm noticing it, that they're described as not seeing each other as people, as human beings. Now, in some sense, of course, they are still human beings. They're at least featherless bipeds and more. So what is the significance of that? And I think it has to be right that it's some kind of moral distinction about how they're thinking or functioning, and whether they put forth effort, I think, is at least a big part of that. Maybe it also has to do with their understanding of their relations to others. Maybe it also has to do with what they're aiming for out of life. Ben's called our attention in the past to the scene where Francisco articulates Reardon's thoughts on their first meeting, right, by saying it's on a night like this that you appreciate the meaning of being a man.
And Greg, the passage I just read from the Tramp, he contrasts, moving on with sitting under a hedge and dying, which is the kind of thing that an animal does. And elsewhere, like when the train is abandoned, Dagny goes to look to see if anybody's doing anything. She's the only one who's looking. Everybody's sitting stuck in their car, hutched over like an animal, she says, and except for Owen Kellogg, of course. So there's a choice here between being a human who acts like an animal and one who tries to move forward, and as opposed to going through cycles in that passage that we saw several chapters ago. For her, the mark of human life is moving forward.
Do animals really sit and wait to die, though? I mean, Carrie Ann, did you?
A little bit different point, but.
Let me say a word about that then first. I mean, animals, when they're out of what they have on, what they go through their automatic cycles, but they at least seemingly unfailingly do go through their automatic cycles. You don't see animals that just, or at least only in very unusual cases do animals just give up and not do anything. They usually will keep going through their cycles, unless they're ill, says Carrie Ann, and maybe.
They do lay down and wait to die if they're seriously ill. I've watched pets die like that. So.
But
I'm reminded that one of my
is that they might just stay where they are and try to adapt
to their situation. Yeah, Carrie Ann?
You asked her whether there were any other points about this part of the chapter, and it was interesting to note how Dagny almost refused complicity in the slave versus slave driver situation when she wanted to say, I apologize, it's not my fault. And she goes, wait a second, no, it is my fault. I chose to enter back into this slave driver system. And so she thinks that it's right for people to hate her for being part of it.
Yeah.
So, unlike most other people, she accepts her complicity and the moral responsibility of her choice.
It's a little bit like the scene where, I think a lot like the scene where Ellis Wyatt comes to kind of berate her at the very beginning for what Taggart Transcontinental does, and she wants to say, no, that's not me, but she's chosen to work for it, and she takes the responsibility. Yeah, that's a really good observation. Okay, so anything? Ellen points out that we get this issue of what's the best within us early on in the novel when Dagny and Eddie are looking at the rails as children. That's right. I don't know if that's a connection to this part of the novel, because I think it's me rather than the novel that gave us the phrase "the best within us" in this chapter, and I was thinking back to that. But it is true. That's what I was thinking of, and I do think there's a connection here. And also, people online are pointing out, as Carrie Ann said, that animals do sit and wait to die when they're sick, and maybe that's a good contrast, Maury, to the case you were talking about the cancer patient who painted her nails. And then Betsy is saying, well, she was looking for a human being, so maybe these people these other people are beings, but they're not human beings. But again, I think the same point still applies, that in some sense they're human beings. I mean, they have human anatomy and some of the human potentials, but in some sense they're not the way you'd expect human beings to be, or the way they should be, or they're not what Francisco thinks about when he talks about the meaning of being a man. So more on all of that as we proceed. So let's go to the tramp story of the 20th Century Motor Company. Why does this story come up, incidentally? Why does he say it? What prompts him to tell it?
Who's John
Why
Galt
is
is
that a word?
yeah.
He's looking for work. He's saying, describing how things were, and everything since then started to go bad, and things weren't bad everywhere. We thought it was only one town, or things have gotten worse and worse. Everything seems to be stopping. This is stopping, and then the motors are stopping, he says, and shudders over the phrase, the motors are stopping. And then says, oh, who is, and she completes it, John Galt. But he doesn't like to say that. And they commiserate over not liking the expression. And he says, well, I might have started it. And she asks how that is, and he tells this story, which he doesn't even get to the John Galt part of until she cycles back. She gets kind of caught up in this story, and it says, like, she's the first person he's seen who might appreciate a plea for justice, so this came sort of pouring out of him. Ben, do you want to start us off on the main plot points of his story or the concretes of his story, and then we'll see where to go from there?
Well, I'll start at least by mentioning some of the basics of the plan that he describes the 20th Century Motor Company having implemented. He starts off by saying they're trying to implement this slogan, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And the author of that slogan is not mentioned in this chapter, but it is Marx and Engels, I believe. And the idea is everybody gets paid basic pittance, but then the profits from the sale of motors are put into a pot and distributed according to need, not according to ability. So if you need healthcare, if you need braces, if you need new tires, that's what goes first. It's not how much did you actually contribute to the productive process. So I mean, it is basically the moral underpinning of the concept of socialism, though in this case it's something like what they call utopian socialism, because it's voted on voluntarily by a private community. This isn't imposed by any government. Almost everybody at the factory agrees to it after having been urged to vote for it by the leadership, the Starnes heirs, who we'll talk about in a second. Incidentally, I think it's not a coincidence that this is happening in a motor factory in the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin in the late 19th century was one of the model so-called progressive states. It was the home to the progressive movement. The Wisconsin politicians were instrumental in implementing a lot of the hallmarks of progressive legislation, which later influenced the New Deal and the Great Society. Milwaukee had the first and only ever socialist mayor, largely, I think, under the influence of the philosophy coming from German universities with which Wisconsinites were familiar. I'm from Wisconsin, and I'm a refugee from there myself, of sorts. Anyway, the story ends, and there's some gaps we'll fill, but the story ends, of course, with Gerald Starnes, one of the heirs, saying, "None of us may now leave this place, for each of us belongs to all the others by the moral law which we all accept." This was one of the pieces of progressive philosophy was popular in this day in Wisconsin. Except one person, a young engineer, dissents and leaves, and he says, I will put an end to this once and for all. I will stop the motor of the world. And of course, at the end of the scene, we find that this is someone whose name was John Galt.
Yeah, and this is the bit of the story that the bum sort of leaves out on his first telling. And she comes back and says, you're going to tell me who John Galt is. And he then flashes back to this first meeting and the bum saying this. And as we'll discuss, the plan goes badly. Things deteriorate. Things get quite ugly at the factory. And at some point, originally, nobody knew much about who is John Galt to say he's going to put an end to this. He's going to stop the motor of the world. But eventually, people started asking that question with a different cast to it. And other people picked out, how could he have done it? How could he have ended things? And other people, as the bum says, didn't know why we said it, but knew the feeling we meant. And so to the bum, John Galt means this avenger, this person who's stopping the world in some kind of retribution for maybe concretely the action that was taken at the 20th century factory, but more generally for this maybe kind of action or for this moral ideal that they're trying to live up to there. And he's a man of some kind of justice who is punishing maybe in particular the people of the 20th Century Motor Company, but maybe the world more generally. And it's no accident that it's called the 20th Century Motor Company, right? This allows for all kinds of phrases like nobody quits the 20th century, and at that time nobody walked out of the 20th century, and this John Galt left the 20th century, and so forth. With the company's meant to be an allegory, I think, for what's happening to the 20th century. This
forgot
name
the best
stands
one.
out. Oh, go ahead.
You forgot the best one, which is once the effects of this plan come to pass and everything ends up collapsing, that was the end of the 20th century. And I mean, talk about prophecy. If this is analogous to, communism and its rise and fall, nothing is. If this isn't analogous, then nothing is. And she wrote this in '57 when it still looked like, communism still had some life in it, but mere 32 years later, this is basically what happened.
Yeah, so let's talk about what does happen then in the factory. And we can talk about it from several different perspectives. What are the effects? And let's start with the easier ones to just specify. What materially are the effects of this plan? What happens? Bankruptcy, ultimately. It takes 2 or 3 years, I think, for bankruptcy, but bankruptcy. Why bankruptcy? I mean...
Well, the producers were punished for producing, and they refused to keep doing so, so the non-producers couldn't create anything of value to sell, so they lost the market.
So production drops almost immediately. There's not much to market. Well, yeah.
Nobody wanted their products anymore. Said
Yeah.
people wouldn't take a motor as a gift anymore if it was marked 20th century.
So even what they managed to produce didn't work. And they got a reputation. It used to be said that the 20th century mark was good at the carat mark on a bar of gold, but now when their planes with their motor, everything with their motor isn't working anymore, the mark starts to work in reverse. Why aren't they producing anything? Well, first, it's just found that production stopped or slowed by, I think, 40% in the first year or 6 months of the plan, I think it was. Now, that was some people left immediately. This John Galt left right away. Some other people must have left in the first months of the plan. What happens when production falls? How do they deal with it? And
They decide who were the ablest, who haven't been delivering according to their ability, and essentially enslave them.
well, yeah, they ask them to work overtime because if production's down, they must not have delivered according to their ability. Carrie Ann, do you want to add something on that?
Oh, well, that part of what happens is the people who are producing get punished, and as a result, they do a go slow. They stop working as hard, so their incentives fall off. If you try to work hard and get punished for it, you're not going to work as hard. And so you
Kid had a
can't.
good idea.
Yeah, kid had a good idea, and he got penalized for it. They thought they could capitalize on it, and he stopped handing out good ideas, stopped turning them over. So you disincentivize production, and the people who were getting the profits of their production grew in number because they're incentivized in a moral hazard structure to cry for need, and then everybody and their grandmother needs something, so what little was being produced kept getting handed out to more and more people who claimed need.
Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, it's, Gerald Starnes, I think, was going on publicity tours around the country, trying to tout their products. It's like he misunderstands the whole situation. Probably he does understand, and he knows that their products are no good, and he's just kind of enjoying being.
Well, is
in
he
the
even
limelight.
trying to tout their products? I mean, he's trying to tout the company as this progressive ideal. When people stop buying their products, he starts saying, well, we need the sales. So he goes by this same thing. Let's talk about this incentive structure. So what happens in the novel is if production falls off, they think someone's not working up to their ability, and so they punish the most productive people. Is that how communism actually works?
I think communism, they more promote their friends, right? It's kind of a power structure.
Mhm.
The good people may not even go to school. They can't get into school, they can't get a job.
So, I
It's
mean,
not that they're
this is,
punishing them, they never can even get through.
this seems like in some sense it's being treated as an allegory for what happens under communism or under socialism. Is there a direct parallel to this under, I mean, what in socialism, or what maybe in the increasingly controlled economy of the novel, is meant to be the parallel between these people being voted most ableist and having to work more?
Progressive income tax is one example.
The unification board. Is another.
So the progressive income tax is an example because more is taken from those who work more. Although here everything's taken from everybody to begin with, so it's more is demanded, so it's maybe similar in structure. How is the unification board?
Well, because that's backed by the force of law in terms of like a guild structure, like who can get in, the criteria are mysterious, you can get dismissed, it's illegal to leave your job, you could be thrown in jail. So that's closer to communism as a structure.
Yeah, although it doesn't have this particular feature of your forced to work up to what they think your abilities are, except that it was said over or under production will be fined. So if somebody underproduces, they'll be fined in a year.
And under the
They had a
communists,
5-year plan in communism.
yes, somebody could be thrown out of his job, but then he was punished for not having a job. You're a parasite.
Yeah.
To Siberia with you.
I mean, what about who here is having to work more every time? I mean, what the tramp, and let's call him by his name just because, you know, you eventually learn his name and he seems like a stand-up guy. So Jeff Allen.
He is a human being.
And he is a human being after all, yeah. So what Jeff Allen notes is that,
Oh, I read it wrong. I read his name was Jeff Alien. I kept reading that. Sorry.
Sorry, I don't know if that came up on Mike, but he heard the name is Jeff Alien. Yeah, for all those people worried about aliens in the economy. But Jeff Allen, his view is the way for every, you know, rotter who ruined a load, we'd have to pay for it with our nights and weekends. Who in the novel have we seen being in that situation?
Hank Reardon.
Yeah, Hank
Has
Reardon.
Reardon Metal made your life easier? No, it's made it much harder.
Yeah, and Reardon and Dagny's response to every catastrophe is, well, we'll just have to work a little harder, right? They are, and we've seen them having to do that, right?
And even Betty Goldman said that. You know, if this is saying if the rich, you know, if everybody's poor, nobody can buy their products. But if they spread the wealth around some more, they'll get to work harder and produce more. I wonder if she even heard what she was saying.
Well, I guess she's on the premise that they enjoy working, which is true. But they don't enjoy having to work harder to correct for everyone else's catastrophe. And we've seen Dagny's coming back, right, because she can't stand that. So it's not that someone else is making her work harder, exactly, but if she's going to be participating in Taggart Transcontinental in this situation where things being as they are, she's going to have to pick up a seemingly ever-growing amount of slack, and in that sense is having to work harder. So the other element that was starting to come out in there's no standards and so forth is how needs are determined. So that's the thing that immediately jumps to Jeff Allen's mind, right? You have to work and you can't have anything until whatever anybody says is someone else's needs are met. And how can you determine people's needs? And why can't he say he needs a yacht? Oh, he can't? Well, then how come he could say I can't have cream in my coffee until his walls are plastered and so forth? So any thoughts on this issue of how the needs are determined? Yeah, Will?
Well, I mentioned on the group an incident back in my old days with the NYU Freedom Fen, where this person was haranguing us about how the rich hoard money they don't need. And one of my associates thereupon said, I need to go to the moon. And we challenged him to prove that this person didn't need to go to the moon.
So the idea is when people can assert their needs, there's no proof that you do need it or don't need it, or if someone says you do need it and therefore you have to provide it to me, how do you show that he doesn't really need it? Any thoughts, Ben? Do we have thoughts from? I see there are a bunch of comments flowing by, but I haven't been able to read them. Are people commenting on this issue?
Skylar makes a good point that generally what happens in the 20th century setup is that the needs are determined by hardship and calamity. It's not like they feel like they want to achieve something and go to the moon. It's who can cry the loudest, who can grovel the most, who's got the biggest misery. And as it turns out, these miseries, of course, multiply because once word gets out, they get their family members and friends who all have miseries to, cash in on this.
Miseries are the coin of the realm, as Jeff Allen puts it, right? So that's significant because a point that's coming out, Will, from what you're saying is you could define needs differently, and you might define them like what you need to achieve your highest stature as a human being or your greatest ambition. But the kinds of needs that are given as needs here are the allaying of suffering. And that is what tends to be cited when people talk about someone being in need being a claim. And we could see that in the kinds of trade-offs that were described. We're not going to send this kid to college because other people have the more pressing need of not even having been sent to high school yet. And we're not going to let this guy get his classical music records. That's not a need because Millie Bush will get a complex if she doesn't get braces for her buck teeth. And we can't have various luxury items, or if you even call them luxury items, but entertainment items, not even tobacco and coffee and such because of the children's milk fund. So it's the needs are things that are sort of to prevent immediate destruction or immediate pain or misery. But I guess it's not even that because Millie Bush's buck teeth aren't that they're going to kill her. So what is it? Yeah.
Ultimately, because so many people demanded needs and there's so little stuff produced to address them, ultimately it was ad hoc by the whims of Ivy Starnes, right? People just brought their pleas to her and she just decided without any rhyme or reason what she thought the greatest needs were, and that's where it ultimately ends up, is people justifying need based on somebody's whim.
Well, was it without any rhyme or reason? So at first it was brought to the committee to vote on. Then that was found that was impractical. So they go to Ivy and plead their case, and then Ivy comes up with a list. But what's her standard?
Bootlickers.
Bootlickers.
Yeah,
And
there
it's
we go.
cronyism, but it is at the whim of who.
Yeah, so it's
code.
arbitrary in that it's at the whim of this one woman.
Mm-hmm.
But Jeff Allen says nobody could do this without some kind of standard, and her standard was bootlicking. So it's who can grovel. And he thinks that's what Ivy was in it for. She gets off on scene groveling. So I want to just shift, because there's a lot to move through on this, to one other, I think, closely related aspect of this, which is Harry says those who bow the deepest, the squeakiest wheel gets the grease, says Anthony. Harry points off the old show Queen for a Day, which the kind of more, worse off you are, the more you were voted for. There's actually an interesting story from Ayn Rand's own life about this, but maybe I'll save that for the forum or a follow-up episode. Do you want to say something?
There's also the sense of like if there's enough money for everyone to get it, then it counts as a need. Like if they have enough to give everybody a suit, then you could get a suit. Or if they have enough to send everybody to college, then you can go to college. Otherwise, you can't. So that there's that sense of like equality.
But those they don't have enough to get everybody gold braces, or everybody the kind of medical care that old woman might need. So the way I think of it is, if it's something that it's either something to address some problem or suffering that you have in the moment, and then you can be special and the only one with that problem or suffering. But if it's not something to address some acute problem or suffering you have, or some way in which you're worse than normal, so to speak, then we have to wait until everybody has enough. So there's a kind of idea of some kind of baseline where everybody just is, without having any positive, some zero level. And if you could show some way at which you're below the zero level, that other people aren't, you can be given the thing to get you back up to the zero. But you can't be anything to get ahead of zero until everybody's got to zero, and now we could all move that little bit ahead together. I think that's how, yeah, in the back.
You just triggered something for me, Greg. I can see a parallel between the old woman that was helped out and the tramp that was going to be helped out. There you go.
So would you say what the parallel you see is?
What's that?
Would you say what the parallel you see is?
What is the parallel I see?
Yeah.
Forcing the weak or the extraneous out of the fold. I mean that the train that wasn't full or anything couldn't afford to let someone that hadn't bought a ticket stay on, so he kills him.
So in the way that
it's clear in the novel that the old woman was killed.
In the way that the tramp and maybe the other residents of Starnesville were ready to kill this old woman, what? And did kill her, or at least maybe killed her. We can't know for sure. At least Jeff Allen doesn't know for sure. Someone was willing to kill Jeff Allen when he couldn't pay his own way. Did someone else had some comment they wanted to make? Yeah.
Just, she made one comment about how people didn't take care of the things they had, their homes, their furniture, and so forth, because they felt like it would just be replaced if they destroyed it. And I thought that was, in the context of this discussion, it's kind of interesting because you can never get out of the hole, because people are constantly digging the hole again, even when you try and help them. And I just see a lot of that today. I mean, many in inner cities, things are just destroyed as a matter of course. And it really is part of the culture.
Well, this brings me to the next point I wanted to get to, because you might think it's, because there are these crummy people who aren't willing to pull their own weight and who are always trying to get something for nothing. There are these chiselers, these cheaters, these dishonest, unscrupulous people about. They're the problem. If we had better people, then they wouldn't be trying to dig themselves deeper in the hole, and this kind of a system would work. But what's Jeff Allen's view of this? What are the spiritual effects of this plan? Yeah, Alex.
It was a horror to everybody involved. Men started to despise one another, and Alan calls it hell on earth. He says it's evil, and all the consequences of the plan were evil.
But why? What's so evil about it? What's the nature of the horror?
He says it wasn't just that it encouraged these rotten people, it turned decent people into rotters.
Yeah, it didn't just encourage some bastards, it turned decent people into bastards. So if you have this kind of a situation where anything you do good, you lose from, it just gets you seen as someone who's going to be pushed harder whenever anybody suffers. You're the one who has to pay for it and make up for it. And anything you do that's unscrupulous or borderline or too far, you get rewarded for. It's not just that. It's not a situation in which you could remain good. You could remain honest, or at least these people aren't able to manage it. Yeah.
Well, later on in his speech, the tramp says that mistakes of this kind are never made innocently.
Mm-hmm.
When the plan was first enacted, at least subconsciously, each man knew what he was getting himself into, and each hoped to muscle in on what his neighbor was going to earn.
Yeah. So there's a good question as to what Allen himself thinks of the workers at the 20th century. Because at the one point, sometimes he says, look, we weren't so innocent when we voted for that plan. We were trying to get something, for nothing. On the other hand, he says, we were a pretty decent bunch of guys when we started. Now, what does he mean by that? I mean, can he have it both ways? I think in a way he can. I think he means, look, people didn't lie. They weren't stealing from their brothers. If they weren't. If you went to this factory before the plan was enacted, you wouldn't see people trying to get out of their work and trying to shift their burdens in a kind of normal day-to-day business. On the other hand, they did vote for this plan, which it creates an unjust system. At least now they were told it was a just system, and partially they believed it. But partially they believed it because it was rationalized something that they knew to be bad about them. And the more uncomfortable they felt about it, the louder they proclaimed it was a noble ideal. So there's a way in which he thinks they were guilty or had some guilt from the start. But they weren't dishonest bastards from the start who they liked the old lady. They were pleased when one of them had a baby, and they would congratulate them. And they were, were a decent community of people who had some fellow feeling for one another and rejoiced in one another's successes. They weren't consumed by resentment. But, we get a lot on. Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
It's an interesting point that contrasts with the point I was making earlier about the connection between Dagny's view of morality and moving forward. If morality is, if a moral code is a mode of power, as Francisco puts it, well then here's an example of the converse. It's an example of a different moral code motivating them to do something they might not have otherwise really been motivated to do. Like you say, they have these kind of secret thoughts and envies, and they're looking for, when they get a rationalization, it helps them to act on it in a way they might not have otherwise. And so it's the power of this opposite moral code in play.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. And what does it actually drive them to? In what sense do they become bastards? Well, they hate each other, right? I mean, all of them, more and more of them are lying and cheating. The ones who started out good or honest realize that they can't play it honestly. They lose whatever things were driving them in life. The old man who just loved classical records couldn't get classical records. The guy who all he wanted to do was send his kid to college, lost that and died in a knife fight over nothing in particular. He just kind of lost all direction and became fighty. These kind of fights were happening more and more. Everybody turned to drink. They were robbing each other in the stores to get it. This old man who likes the classical, I don't know if he's old, but this guy who likes the classical music, and his classical music he's not allowed his record, but Millie Bush has to get these braces, punches her teeth out. Are you excited? You like that he punched the teeth out? What's going on here, Robert?
It's a horrible thing.
I mean, it's an interesting scene, but I don't think we're meant to view it as like, damn right, that bitch had it coming, right?
It's more of a sense of outrage at the injustice of the system, where this guy is robbed of something that was meaningful to him, and this other person who didn't earn the product that was awarded to her.
Well, she was 8.
Her family. I'm not blaming the little girl. It's the family.
Apparently the guy blamed the little girl. He didn't punch his father out. He punched the girl out.
It's a terrible thing. I mean, dark humor has a very strange aspect to it, so I laugh.
Why is the girl ugly and a brat?
Because the parents are terrible.
Oh, so the girl might be a brat because the parents are terrible. They raised her badly.
Yeah.
Why is she ugly? I mean, it doesn't seem like the narrator is like piling on this girl and making it.
It's definitely the way that it's told, that you're supposed to be a little bit more sympathetic towards the poor old widower with no family, and the records are all that he had. And
I don't think he's a widower. I don't think he was ever married. This was all he ever. Was he a widower? Or because he said this is all he ever found out of life. Maybe he found a wife and
maybe the wife
lost her.
wasn't. Yeah, the phonograph records were a lot more appealing than the wife. But
I guess it's all he got out of life in his old age. But I think there's a reason why she's ugly, which is I think that's why she was voted the brave. If it would be a different kind of a story if there was this girl in town who was gorgeous and could have been a film star, except her nose was a bit too big. and they voted her the nose job she could need to become the beauty of the ages and have success in Hollywood. Right? That would be like someone who we're enhancing what's good about them. But if she's an ugly girl with the braces, it's not like she's going to be good looking, but she'll be a little less ugly than it suggests the kind of value system that the people doing the voting or Ivy Starnes is on about. It's not about helping people get ahead. It's about solving a misery. At least that's, I think, the significance of the Millie Bush story. And I don't think, the point of it is that good for this guy for getting back at her. It's look at what we've become, that this is what happens here.
But some of the comments on the online discussion here are talking about ugly in character, that she was also a mean little girl, right? So it's a character assessment of not just the person involved, but of the system that awards on these grounds.
Yeah, she's
representative.
bratty and ugly.
Yeah.
So I think she is described as bratty, but I think she's
make her mean, and
Right.
that's a choice, and I think it's done so that people have a little bit less sympathy for her. I'm not
I
saying
agree.
that there is a thing about good for she had it coming, but there's definitely a way that when you read this, you're like and it's kind of the staff psychology. It's not like she had a medical need where she she couldn't eat or she had problems with her teeth. It's the staff psychologist thought she would have an inferiority complex. It's really there's some bitterness there, I think. When Rand wrote this, I feel like a little bit that turned me off a little bit. But
what's the question I'm interested in is what's the bitterness directed at? Yeah,
I think
I know
we're move on
sorry.
Yeah.
I just wanna
past Millie Bush.
I
much
get
as
that. Okay,
she's
so
funded.
this is what it's turned. This system has turned people into this, but I think that's a little too simple of an answer. It's kind of like, they had no choices. The system turned them into this. There is some choice involved, some place.
So this goes back to the issue that Alex and Will were raising of what kind of people were these. But I think at least a big part of the significance of this is, so always you're thinking in the world of the novel, why are the people acting as they are? And also, why has the author made a world such like this to make which point? My take on this is that in the world of the novel, people are awarding this to Millie Bush because she's ugly, needy, has these problems with her, and that's their motive in doing it. That's Ivy Starnes' motive. And that the author's intent is to illustrate that motive. And it's a clearer case of it than... but I think there is a lot of resentment on the author's part towards that motive and on Jeff Allen's part towards it. But we need to move on, so let's come back to this on the Facebook group. The only other people's motives we should discuss, I think, is, and Ben, you want to just give us some summary point on this, is the motives of, we already discussed the motives of the workers, but what about the motives of the Starnes heirs?
Well, Jeff Allen gives us a quick summary of what they were after, and Eric Starnes basically wants to be loved by his workers. He spends a lot of time hanging around, kind of basking in their gratitude. Gerald,
Paul, he's the guy, Eric, who later we learned, I just want to be loved, was the thing he said, and then when some young woman doesn't love him, he kills himself over it. I've lost your sound.
I should be back now, I hope.
Okay, yeah.
Anyway, Gerald then is the one who spends a lot of money on flashy clothes and cars. Though it seems like his motive is something like prestige in the eyes of society, which he says he's doing to raise the prominence of the plant, but could be at least Jeff Allen seems to wonder if there are other reasons. And then we get to Ivy, where he says she truly didn't care about material goods. She seems to mainly, and we talked about this a little already, care about the kind of power that she gets to exercise over people by seeing them grovel before her when she decides who the benefits get to be doled out by. And it's interesting, I think, to think about what all these motives have in common, if anything. certainly at first glance, they seem to be different. Though Jeff Allen says that he thinks they all stood to profit in one way or another, if you understand that profit depends on what it is you're after. They were all after something. This is something we're going to have to get back to later, I think, though. It's interesting that Jeff Allen says there's no money on earth that could buy what someone like Ivy Starnes was after. That's the second reference we've had to money, by the way. We had the earlier one where misery was the coin of the realm. And this is a chapter called The Sign of the Dollar, which a sign which has yet to make its appearance in this chapter. But let's move forward and see how it does and how it relates.
Is they weren't after money. Money is too clean and innocent for that.
Yeah.
Francisco would have a lot more to say
Yeah,
along that
I mean,
line.
Francisco had this point, money is too noble a medium for certain things. And I think we're seeing that in Jeff Allen's perspective on what Ivy wants, right? No, their father, no matter how much he paid them, he didn't have enough money to talk to his lousiest worker the way Ivy talked to some of their best people. And I think it is significant also, just best worker. There were still some good workers there in the 20th century, the people who had been productive and good workers under the old plan, and yet this suppressed the best and brought out the worst in them. And maybe something bad in them was part of their motive for doing it. Maybe in other ways, and this is, Mario, what you're suggesting, they were complicit, or there was something in them that made them worse that wasn't just, you can't just blame it on the circumstances. Or somebody, or maybe, was it Alex you were saying that? Someone was saying these people, but it did bring out the worst and suppress the best. That's at least how the plan is being portrayed. And what were people after in doing this? We have Jeff Allen's view of what the workers were after, muscling in on their betters' profits. So they were after money. And were able to disguise it to themselves by this. Gerald was after prestige or something. Ivy was after being groveled before. Maybe there's more to say than that about it. And Eric wanted to be loved. We get one other reference to Ivy Starnes' motives, by the way, in this chapter, right? That's not to do with Jeff Allen. Dagny asks Owen Kellogg at one point if he'd ever heard of a woman named Ivy Starnes, which is a slightly odd question to ask him, since she's not all that famous, and even odder that he responds, "Oh yes." And Dagny thinks that the people on the train, this is something he would like. But how could you live with people like that? Go ahead, Ben.
Something she would like, Ivy. But what she says, of course, what Owen Kellogg says is, what makes you think Ivy Starnes' purpose is life?
Yeah. So what is it about, and this brings us to the next issue, the frozen train. So what is it that stands out to Dagny about the frozen train? Well, the crew is left. We already see her thinking there's something right or good about the crews having left. Good for them, they're human beings. What about the people left? What are we meant to notice, and what does Dagny notice about the people who are passengers on this train? And how is that conveyed? I mean,
Nat Taggart couldn't have worked with them.
Good. Nat Taggart couldn't have worked with them, couldn't have employed them, couldn't have used them as customers. He'd have no use for these people. Alex?
These people were passive. They were not willing to take responsibility for their own lives or for what life requires. And
Good.
They
So
demanded it of others.
what shows us that that's true of them?
Well, for example, the woman who said to Dagny that you're a common carrier, you need to give a service. And that's when something clicks in Dagny's head. She realizes she can just leave them here, and then the woman won't be able to report back to any board.
Yeah, I mean, you might think, well, I mean, it is her railroad this woman bought a ticket on, and the train got stranded in the middle of nowhere. I mean, in some sense, you might think she does owe them transport. Maybe she's being unreasonable. Yeah, I do.
I think it's important to I don't think they're passive. I think you made it, they're demanding. That's not a passive thing.
Well,
They're aggressive.
I meant passive as in they will not do anything themselves.
Yeah, but that's not passive. You know, I mean,
Well-
I don't, it's not a semantic thing, but, you know, they're not like this, they're,
When do they start being demanding?
When somebody steps up to be in charge.
Yeah. So if we start with how we meet them, right? Dagny goes out of her car. She's walking down trying to figure out what happened. And she notices an unusual combination of lighted compartments, I think it's open doors, and empty passageways. So everyone's up, everyone's noticed something's happened, but nobody's doing anything about it. Except for her and Owen Kellogg. And then later when Jeff Allen wakes up and realizes what happened, he runs down and immediately starts doing something about it. But at first, no one's doing anything about it. And it's only when Dagny and Owen Kellogg kind of assume control that by some special instinct, these people come out of their holes. And now they're demanding suddenly. So you could say they're passive, you could say they're demanding, you could say they're demanding when they're taken care of, or they're enabled to be demanding by the fact that someone else has taken responsibility. Dagny is very mean to them, right? I mean, very hard on these people. I mean, she doesn't just, one thing when the woman is really demanding of her and you're a common carrier and what are you going to do, blah, blah, blah. At one point she says, well, you know, you can't report me to the Unification Board unless I take you to them. I could just lock you out here. All right, but that woman's, you know, being nasty to her. I mean, even before that or at a different point than that, she says she's going to go to the division point and so forth. And one of the women is worried about being left there. What about the raiders that are around? What's her reaction to that?
Unfortunately, there are no reports of raiders attacking like frozen train. So she's
Yeah.
like, yeah.
There are no,
Unfortunately.
unfortunately, it would be better if raiders came and killed you people. And this is really dark. Why so dark?
And later
Because
later
the
when
raiders
she's
showed
talking
up,
with
they
Owen
get
Kellogg,
killed too.
Go ahead, Ben.
I was just saying, later when she's talking with Owen Kellogg, she describes how she's left the Jeff Allen behind to make sure that the cattle don't stampede. So she's thinking of them as cattle. There's this other place where she doesn't see them as having human eyes. She just sees moist ovals in the darkness. So I mean, yeah, she's got a pretty dim view of these customers, and perhaps to some extent they deserve it. But this is another instance of, you know, where people online commented that she's not seeing them as human beings.
She loathes
and
them.
I just
I mean,
wanna-
it's not just like, it wouldn't bother me too much if some raiders killed you folks. She wishes some raiders would come by, or at least she's being sarcastic and snide about it. She really has hatred for these people.
Yeah, though I did want to add one bit of context here. This phrase about common carrier. This is not just saying we have a contract with you to deliver a service. This is a term of legal art, as several people pointed out in the previous online discussion, where having to do with interstate commerce regulation. And I mean, here it's being imposed on them basically by provisions of previous edicts, I assume, that where they have to provide this kind of transportation. They can't like decide not to have these customers. And it's worth noting that this is the same language that's used these days in debates about net neutrality. If the ISPs are going to be regulated under net neutrality, it's about whether they'll be considered as common carriers. Now, I take it there that the idea is common carriers because they're supposed to serve everyone in common, but I think Rand is playing with that language a bit here. And when the woman says, "You're a common carrier," Dagny's listening to her as if she's saying, "You're just a common carrier," a common as opposed to, you know, exceptional. And that's, I think, what Kellogg is playing with when he's saying that woman regards you in such a
And
low
I
light.
interpreted it as not that you're commonplace, but that you're held in common. You're everyone's carrier. You belong to us and are owed. Either way you interpret it, though, it's something that Dagny and Kellogg would both take as an insult. But Dagny thinks of herself as a slave and a slave driver. So she's a slave driver with respect to her men, right? And that's why she feels like, good for them, they deserted. They're not willing to be slaves under my whip. But she's a slave to these kind of people. She has to provide them with transportation. It's not, if you bought a ticket from somebody who was voluntarily selling you the ticket, and then the train craps out and they have a responsibility to provide you with transportation kind of based on the agreement you made. But if everybody's forced to deal with one another and she's forced to run trains for you whether she wants to or not and so forth, then, the whole morality of the situation is skewed and it's different. And we're in a situation like the situation where people were in Starnesville, where they had to start hating each other. And I think we're seeing her hating the passengers, them hating her, except not Kellogg and not Jeff Allen, because those are people who have risen above this situation, and now they see we're in this emergency, we're stuck here in the middle of nowhere, we care about our lives, what are we going to do about it? And so Owen Kellogg thinks about, well, how can I help to get to where I want to go and help you who also wants to get there? How can we work together to get there? I think part of what we're meant to see as Dagny finding so ominous in the passengers is by contrast to how Jeff Allen reacts. As soon as he wakes up, he runs off the train. He says what's going on and what's to be done about it. Now, he doesn't know what to do about it, but at least he's asking and he's not hiding and waiting for her to tell him or demand something of him. Just what can we do about it? How can I help? As soon as she says, I'm going to go to the division point or I'm going to go to the next thing and call the division point, you can't go alone. There are raiders, which is what nobody else said. Somebody mentioned there were raiders because they were worried the raiders would get them. And she said, oh, you're right. I'll need someone to come with me. And no one steps up, as someone online pointed out. I don't see who. Lester pointed out. So, if the passengers had reacted like Jeff Allen, then I think she would have a different view. But it's significant that Jeff Allen's a tramp who stowed away. These are not the kind of people Taggart Transcontinental is serving. And the kinds of people it is serving are just making demands of her, aren't showing any appreciation for the fact that of everyone in this situation, she and Owen Kellogg are the only ones who are willing to step up. Even if Dagny had not been the president of this railroad, because Owen Kellogg is involved in the railroad, right? Imagine Dagny wasn't here. He would have been the only one working to try to get the train running. And she would have made demands of him because he's the one who's trying to accomplish things. And they make these demands as soon as they feel taken care of, as soon as they feel safe. All right, so 2 topics remaining to us. Dagny and Kellogg, and Dagny's decision to stay with or leave the train, and, 3, and then what we learn from Dagny's flights. So, just quickly, what do we learn about Owen Kellogg? We learn a few concrete facts that are interesting. We already knew that he's been working as a manual laborer because we saw him in part 2 when he was the guy packing the train cars and talking to Mr. Moen. So we learned he's been doing this day work, but now Dagny learns it. Why is he on this train? Yeah.
Well, he wants to get somewhere more than anybody else, and to get to a place with his friends.
For a month's vacation.
For a month's vacation, and we also learned that he smoked cigarettes that have the dollar sign on them.
Which are made by one of his friends, but not being a common carrier, he only sells them for his friend. That's the meaning of common carrier again, not owned in common, right? They're sold for 5 cents in gold, for which there's no medium of exchange. Dagny realizes for the first time what many of us have already realized, that he's one of them. She tries to hire him back, but he'll only take a job as a manual laborer. He's heard of Ivy Starnes.
There's a little history of the United States with the symbol of the dollar sign.
Oh yeah, so that's the point. His ideas. She asks him what does this stand for, this $ symbol? And he says it stands for, greed and on every pig-like character and so forth. And so it's a brand of infamy. But it also stands as a symbol of the money of a free country for all the kinds of things we heard about from Francisco in his speech. Robert, you say we get this history of how the $ got created. I'm pretty sure that history is not true, that it's not, in fact, based on the initials of the United States. There's a really good article, I think on Quora or somewhere, about the history of the $ that I think pretty squarely debunks this. It was in use before, and it couldn't have been based on that. But in any case, in this world, or to Owen Kellogg's understanding, this is the history of it, and it's associated with America in any case, the U.S. dollar.
Greg?
Yes. Go ahead, Ben.
I think it's important that the section where Kellogg is describing what he takes to be the history of the $ recalls the previous discussion that the two of them have had about Nat Taggart and how he wouldn't have. So Nat Taggart is one of these money bags who's supposed to be whose depravity is supposed to be symbolized by this dollar. And the previous discussion about Nat was, of course, that he wouldn't have wanted to deal with the kind of people on this train, but Ivy Starnes would have. And I mean, there's a kind of back and forth between those two as symbols, and which is, I think, especially telling given that we're told that Ivy Starnes isn't interested in money. There's no money on earth that will buy what she wants, and there's no exchange rate between dollars and gold and the currency that's circulating in the world that's run by the various Ivies and her equivalents today.
Where the seen as giving you title to something is your need or the demands you make, and
Right.
not what you provide to the people that you're demanding things of. Because that's what money symbolized, right, for Francisco. It's and Will, you brought up Reardon's Francisco-influenced statement of what his motives were, right? To exchange my best effort for the best efforts of other people, with money being the medium of that. That's conspicuously absent from the passengers. It's not like, I've done my best for you to earn my hard-earned dollars to buy this ticket, and why aren't you stepping up equally? It's at least that's not how they're framing it, and that's not how Dagny thinks of what they're doing. They're thinking in terms
and don't
of,
forget, Greg,
you're a common carrier. Yeah.
not only that, but there's also the threat that if you don't get us transportation, we expect transportation, same language David pointed out that Kip Chalmers used in the other train scene. They don't reach the same fate, apparently. Helps that Dagny's there to help them out. But anyway, in any case, both cases, they're threatening reporting them to the Unification Board. So rather than offering value, they offer a threat. And that's, again, significant if you relate this back to Francisco's speech, because remember, Francisco says, you've got a choice. You've got the choice between dollars and guns. You either trade goods or you trade men. And it seems like this society has now made one of those choices. And that has something to do with why there's no exchange rate.
Good point. So Dagny, they get to the phone. There's some interesting, the first phone doesn't work. They get to a second phone. There's some interesting discussion with the guy at the end of the other phone who's incompetent and only responds to threats himself. And they also learn that there's an airport nearby. And so Dagny decides she'll let Owen Kellogg husband the train back to safety, and she'll fly to Utah. And a few interesting thoughts here. Why is Dagny doing that? Why does she make this choice? I was just saying that, and Ben's putting the links around. So I was just saying that Dagny decides to go and fly off in pursuit of Quentin Daniels, leaving Owen Kellogg to deal with the train. And Kellogg's willing to do this. So I think there are two questions we want to ask about this. Why does she make this choice? Why does Kellogg encourage it? I don't think we could say too much about the second of those, but we should just note what's said about it. And then I want to just spend a couple of minutes on Dagny's thoughts as she's flying. So first of all, why does Dagny make this choice?
Well, she needs to know that somebody like Quentin Daniels is still working on the motor.
Mhm.
That's her motive power right now, is knowing that work is still being done by an active mind.
Okay, so part of it is she's really eager to get to Daniels. And why is she really eager to get to Daniels? The motor is needed to keep her going. We've had that idea before, and it's reiterated in this chapter. The idea that there's some great mind working on a great problem somewhere. Moreover, the Jeff Allen story, right, has recapitulated to her the idea that there is a destroyer. There's a John Galt, some active person who's the destroyer, who's particularly out to stop motors. And so we see, while she's kind of fitfully sleeping and waking up even before the train stops, she has the idea, here's one motor he's not going to stop, right? She's thinking in terms of this destroyer now with a name to him, John Galt, who's out there going to stop the motor. He's the one who's going to go and seize and get Daniels, and she's got to stop that from happening. So it's become, this belief in a destroyer has been reinvigorated. It's always been there, but it's been further fortified. She now has a name. She's much more on the premise of it as a conscious intent with this destroyer trying to do this, and she's going to stop him. She's got to stop this, seemingly this John Galt from destroying the motor. Interestingly, this destroyer, John Galt, was at the 20th Century Motor Factory. Perhaps he's responsible for the original fate of this motor. Maybe she's thinking that,
Right.
although she doesn't say it. Maybe he's the one who stopped it the first time. Yeah.
I do think it's interesting, though, that everything you've mentioned so far has been more or less true for several chapters now. Her motivation to find the motor, thinking that there's this destroyer. I mean, you're right that it's underscored in various ways, but she was all ready to stick with Kellogg and stick with the train right up until the last minute. Even when she's speaking on the phone, she says, "Come, send a track cart and pick up me and Mr. Kellogg." And then in the final exchange, she says, "Pick up Mr. Kellogg." So she makes
A part
this
of it
decision.
is, part of it is until that last minute she doesn't know for sure that the thing's an airfield.
Right.
And even before
Right.
the frozen train happened, she had the thought of getting off the train, finding an airline, and finding an airfield and doing it. So what is it that changes her mind? Well, there's the positive values that she wants to get to Kellogg. Those may be made more urgent by having learned Jeff Allen's story about this destroyer, John Galt. What about the negative values? Well, what's worse now than it was before the frozen train is she's very aware of the passengers on this train. And they're not people who she wants to help. She has real contempt for them. And then also there is something in particular that happens that's part of her thoughts when she's talking to this night operator at Bradshaw. And what's that? I mean, what's the conversation with this Bradshaw night dispatcher like?
She was more competent when she first started at Rockdale than he is now.
Yeah, I mean, she's doing his job for him,
Yep. Every
right?
single
He
aspect
can't
of
even
it.
figure out, like, how do I get people out to your train? Well, do you have a motor car? No. What about doesn't your wrecker have an engine? Why don't you put them on this thing? I mean, just really basic decisions. So, in effect, what her job is, so long as she stays here now, is to do this menial job, a lower position from where she started from. At least she was good at being a night dispatcher. When she started, it's the choices between doing this thing she desperately wants to do, being with a mind like that can work on a motor like this, saving the motor from the destroyer, or like lame busy work that's a drag, that's not accomplishing anything, and that what it's saving these passengers who aren't even human to her anymore. And
Right.
Ben, you'd made the point about the.
Well, I thought I would also read the last part of that passage. Was it, why is she doing this work? Was it in order to remain where she had started, night operator of Rockdale Station? No, lower than that, because this guy is lower than that. She had been better than that. Dispatcher, even at Rockdale. Was this to be the final sum and end lower than her beginning? There was no reason to hurry. She was the reason. They needed the trains, but they did not need the motor. She needed the motor. Her duty to whom? And so here we see again the link between the motor and motion and morality. And of course, later or Owen Kellogg says, "Just for once, I'd like to see you do something you want to do." And to go back to the night operator, I mean, at the beginning of the chapter, she'd been reflecting on Francisco's reminder that she wouldn't run these trains if they were empty. And well, she gets on the train and she does notice it's half empty. And then the crew leaves, and the people who are left after that are these people she has a hard time regarding as even human. So they're half empty in a physical sense, but it almost seems like they're completely empty in a spiritual sense. So she's losing track of why it is that she wants to run trains. Now she's not quitting, right? And she reminds Kellogg of that, insistently when she's going off to the airfield. But she's doing this for her, she says, not for them, and not for the railroad.
Significant, incidentally, that it's when they make the decision to abandon the train that the workers show regard for the humanity of the people on the train. And I think we see this pattern if you look at the people who quit. If you look at the way Ken Daniger looked when he was in the courtroom. There's a sense in which after quitting, the people who quit are somehow more in touch with humanity and their feeling for other people. And right before they quit, they seem to be particularly out of touch with it, or at least some of them do, feel particularly alienated from people. And maybe we don't know exactly what's going on with these deserters on the frozen trains, but they might be part of the destroyer's cabal as well. There at least seems to be some parallelism to what's going on there. Carrie Ann?
Yeah, and actually, also that brings up another sinister, dehumanizing touch here in this passage. Right before Dagny gets off the phone with the night dispatcher, she goes down another level and does something she's never done before, which is the pull peddling mechanism, because reason didn't work with this guy. She tried to use her best with him and appeal to his best. It didn't work, because she's like, "Do you know who I am?" Right? And it brings out the worst in her.
Yeah, whether it's exactly that, whether it counts as pull peddling or not, it is dealing with people by threats, and it says she's never done it before, right? Yeah.
And this
Ben?
links us back to our discussion of the 20th Century Motor Company, where we talked about how when they were living under this plan inspired by this moral ideal, even the best people became worse than they were before. And why is it that people on this train are seeing each other as less than human? Well, I mean, Jeff Allen thought that the reason that they became the way they became was because they were expected to be beasts of burden, basically. They were expected to be sacrificial animals for each other. How can you regard your fellow man as your brother when that's what you are expecting, when they're expecting of you, and when you're then thinking of them as just someone who's demanding sacrifices? You'll punch them in the face.
Yeah, and when they're
or lock up the train.
A cause of constant potential burdens to you and of no benefits. Or when they are benefits, it's benefits sucked joylessly out of them at their own expense, as opposed to you get the contrast in the other train scene where we talked about how you used to be able to serve your own values by serving the people you deal with, but in this system you can't. So we get a sense of why Dagny wants to leave. It's choosing her values and what matters to her over this drudgery and slavery and something that's pointless to her. Daniel's, where Kellogg wants her to do it because he wants to support that. If there's anything you want to do, rather than nursing these people, I want you to know what it feels like. All right, so now our last topic, and let's just spend a couple of minutes. What's the significance of these flights? What is Dagny thinking about as she's flying? So the world looks to her like a convict's ball as she's taking off, dropping away. As she's flying away from this train in Taggart Transcontinental. It's like she's been chained to it and she's finally finding freedom. As she looks down, she sees the electric lights on the ground. Those lights had been the stars she's always aspired to. What does it mean to say that the lights were the stars she aspired to? She contrasts them with the actual stars and the role the stars play to people as some kind of ideal or thing to reach for. But reaching for the stars, you can't actually get the stars. There's nothing they require of you to be up there and to be led. She calls them the tinsel of futility, to long for the stars. They're things that are going to be, there's nothing you can do about them when they're up there. But the lights require something of you to be led. And to attain the lights is to do the work of keeping the motors running. And to do whatever, to do your job well, to achieve something, to produce something, to be making the world go. And that's what she's aspired to. So who's made that a convict's world, a convict's ball? There are lots of these people who profess some lofty ideal that they can't do anything about, that there's nothing to achieve there, and really they just want to sit around and not do anything or have other people do things for them or make demands. But that's not her. She's been this person who was a go-getter. She wanted to achieve things. She had values that can be achieved. And she worked to achieve them, and there's these electric lights. So the world is what she aspired to into making. But someone's made of it a convict's ball. Who? Why? So that's one line of thought that she's having. What other lines of thought are there while Dagny's flying to and from Utah? She's enjoying the feeling of control and of sight while she's in the plane. There's this idea about the sight givers. Ben, I know you had some thoughts on this at one point.
Well, they were thoughts I was going to bring up in a later chapter, but it is interesting that, she sees this, at least for the moment, she feels her mind is at one with her body, which is hearkening back a bit to the running of the John Galt line scene. We haven't seen her internal experience described this way really since then.
And there's the idea that, so yes, good, so there's that mind-body unity. There's also the idea that part of the other thing is she's kind of in concert with people like the people who made the plane and who made the controls on it, and the people who gave us sight, condensed thought, condensed milk, condensed music, these condensers and sight givers, and where are these people now? So this is the plea of where are the people? That's the other element that's troubling her. And of course, she's going after one of the last of these people. She, of course, she's risking danger in doing this, right? She's taking the most difficult course over mountains, but she has to get to Daniels as soon as possible. All right, she lands. She finds out that Daniels has just left in that other plane taking off. She rushes after it. Now it's as though the destroyer who's running the other plane, she assumes, is flying her plane for her by remote control almost. She's just locked on following the destroyer. What's she thinking about on this trip? At some point here, she hears a piece of music. Is it the first trip or the second? I think it's the second. It's the first trip. Good. So Halley's fourth concerto on the first trip, which is a cry of defiance, a no flung at this kind of torture that's reserved for the people who see the torture isn't necessary. I forgot what trip it is. So that's on the first trip. So that's summing up her state of mind.
That's the first.
Good. On the first trip. Then what on the second trip? Well, now she's into an even more dangerous situation. She's doing it with low fuel. She's desperately following the destroyer, the most evil creature on earth that she wanted to, kill. At least she assumes it's the destroyer. She's going to save Daniels from him. Although it's not clear how the hell she thinks she's going to do that. She doesn't have any fuel left. She's in the middle of the mountain. She's circling around in some kind of rocky area where she thinks he's crashed and where nobody could possibly land. So what's she going to do? She can't land. She's just not like a helicopter where she could send a thing down to pick him up. It's unclear what she thinks she's accomplishing by this, other than she's following the destroyer to the end.
I think the most important phrase is she's going to be willing to give her life in pursuit of him if she could take his first.
Yeah.
Because she wants to stop him stopping the motor of the world.
To destroy the destroyer.
Mm-hmm.
To stop the man stopping the motor of the world at any cost. And she has no real hope other than that. There's no way she can get out of this.
And Greg, we've heard the language of giving one's life earlier in this chapter, and it was in the passage that connected to the title of the chapter where Kellogg is talking about the sign of the dollar. If this be evil by the present standards of the world, if this is the reason for damning us, then we, the dollar chasers and makers, accept it and choose to be damned by that world. We choose to wear the sign of the dollar on our foreheads proudly as our badge of nobility, the badge we are willing to live for, and if need be, to die, which is not an idea you usually associate with dollar chasers, interestingly.
Yeah, it's that they're willing to die for the sake of the ideal of dollar chasing. But Dagny's now willing to die not even to save the motor exactly, but to destroy the destroyer. Although I guess maybe by doing that she will save the motor. She's heard the fourth concerto, which is this hopeless, I mean, it's in a way hopeful, but it's defiant, but it's this Byronic kind of concerto again, on her way on the first flight. What are her last thoughts of this second flight? Somehow she has this certainty that it's going to be all right. In answer to the earth, I'll just read here. Her arms pulling at the reel with no chance to know whether she could succeed. With her space and time running out, she felt in a flash of its full violent purity that special sense of existence which had always been hers. And for people who know Rand's nonfiction, the sense of existence I think is the same as the concept of sense of life. That special sense of existence which had always been hers. In a moment's consecration to her love, to her rebellious denial of disaster, to her love of life and the matchless value that was herself, she felt the fiercely proud certainty that she would survive. And what does she say as her cry of rebellion, which she used before, right? In answer to the earth that flew to meet her, she heard in her mind, as her mockery at fate, as her cry of defiance, the words of the sentence she hated, the words of defeat, of despair, and of a plea for help. Ah, hell, who is John Galt? And for the answer to whether she survives, and maybe to more, tune into the next chapter. We'll have Ben, or rather read the next chapter, but tune in also to our discussion of it. We'll have Ben here with us in New York, and so we won't be plagued by disaster that brings him on and off of our connection.
Supposing that I can expect transportation.
Supposing that you could. Lines are indeed common carriers. And
They are common carriers these days.
Goodbye to all. Who is John Galt? And we'll see you next week.
Thanks.
Good night, everyone.